Thank you very much, Rina, for these remarks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone joining us, colleagues and partners. It's such a pleasure to welcome you today to the launch of this new policy brief, which explores the link between measuring opportunities for women in peace operations, MOWIP, and Women, Peace and Security National Action Plans under UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Over the past 2 decades, the WPS agenda has really become one of the most developed normative frameworks in the peace and security field. We're not starting from scratch at all. We have strong political commitments, we have an established architecture, and in many countries, now various generations of well-developed national action plans that articulate ambitious goals for women's participation, protection, and leadership. Yet, as this brief makes clear, impact remains uneven, particularly when it comes to women's meaningful participation in security institutions. Many national action plans are comprehensive and aspirational, but they're not always sufficiently specific. They may lack robust baselines, measurable indicators, clear institutional ownership, and the kind of analytical depth that is needed to drive transformative change. In other words, we're well equipped, but we could be a bit more scientific. And this is where MOWIP offers real added value. As an analytical methodology, MOWIP helps diagnose institutional barriers and enablers to women's participation in uniformed services. It generates both qualitative and quantitative evidence. It provides institution-specific recommendations. And crucially also, it establishes baselines that can strengthen monitoring frameworks, targets, and indicators within WPS national action plans. Our research across 7 countries for this work shows that while direct integration of MOWIP findings into national action plans is still limited, MOWIP assessments are often shaping institutional gender strategies, donor programming, and implementation priorities beneath or alongside the NAPs. Canada stands out as a particularly strong example of explicit alignment between MOWIP findings and NAP implementation. In many other contexts, the connection is indirect, partial, or still aspirational. This is often due to timing, to coordination challenges, or to limited resourcing. The core message of this publication is simple, but it's important. If we are more intentional in aligning MOWIP processes with Women, Peace and Security National Action Plans governance cycles, we can significantly strengthen the impact of both. And this conversation is now especially timely. At this very moment, the LCA Initiative Fund is reviewing the next batch of MOWIP applications. As new assessments are being considered and launched, there is a real opportunity now to ensure that their findings are strategically connected to national action plans from the outset, not as an afterthought, but as an integral part of policy design and implementation. Let me also express here our sincere appreciation to Canada for its continued leadership and support for the Women, Peace and Security agenda and for championing innovative approaches such as MOWIP. Canada's example demonstrates what is possible when political commitment, analytical rigor, and implementation are brought in close alignment. I hope that today's conversation will help us move from parallel processes to purposeful integration, strengthening both the MOWIP and national action plans so that they deliver measurable, meaningful change for women in security institutions. And with that, I will now hand over the floor to Ms. Sarah Rose for her to present the findings of this work more in detail. Thank you very much. I look forward to this conversation. Over to you, Sarah.
Great. Thank you very much, Natalie. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's my pleasure to present the findings from this research exploring if and how the Measuring Opportunities for Women in Peacekeeping methodology, or MOWIP, can be used not just as an assessment tool, but as a strategic lever to strengthen women, peace and security national action plans. Next slide, please. So, why this matters? Well, WPS national action plans have expanded rapidly over the past 25 years and have become well-established policy tools to operationalise the women, peace and security agenda. Over the same period, we've seen increasingly ambitious commitments under NAPs to expand women's participation in the military, in the police, in peace operations. Yet across contexts, impact remains uneven, particularly when it comes to women's meaningful participation within security sector institutions. A substantial body of WPS literature and NAP analysis points to some recurring challenges. So participation commitments are often vague, under-resourced, weakly monitored, and lacking clear institutional ownership. Many defence and police-owned participation targets still foreground numerical indicators, so how many women deployed, how many recruited, how many trained. But as we all know, meaningful participation is not simply about numbers. It concerns safety, influence, retention, leadership pathways, institutional culture, to name but a few. And the gap between ambitious commitments and institutional realities is precisely where MOWIP becomes relevant. Next slide, please. So, against this backdrop, let me briefly recap what MOWIP offers before discussing the research scope, its methodology, and the key findings. As most of you will already be familiar, the MOWIP methodology, as Natalie reinforced, developed jointly by DCAF and the Gender and Security Sector Lab at Cornell University. And it's a comprehensive methodology designed to identify the barriers and the enablers to women's meaningful participation in peace operations from the perspective of troop and police contributing countries. It analyses across 10 institutional dimensions, so including recruitment, deployment, leadership, workplace culture, family policies. And importantly, it generates both quantitative and qualitative data, producing institution-specific diagnostics and recommendations. So, although it's designed around peacekeeping participation, its findings illuminate much broader institutional dynamics. And that's critical. It's precisely this broader institutional relevance that has prompted this research. Next slide, please. So, looking at research scope, the research asks a really simple question. So, can MOWIP evidence be used to strengthen WPS National Action Plan commitments on women's participation? And if so, how? The research broadly explored whether MOWIP findings, for example, are explicitly integrated into NAP texts, whether they shape targets or indicators and subsequent monitoring, whether they've strengthened institutional engagement with WPS-NAP development and implementation processes, or in fact, do the processes operate in parallel? And our starting premise was that tools like MOWIP can strengthen WPS-NAPs by generating actionable evidence on institutional barriers and enablers to women's participation in security institutions. And the analysis focused on women's meaningful participation in security institutions, really reflecting MOWIP's core analytical strength. Next slide, please. Okay, So looking at the methodology and the countries selected. So the study combines interviews, document review, and comparative analysis across 7 countries. Interviewees were identified using snowball sampling, and interviewees were either directly involved in the MOWIP process or indeed in the WPS-NAP development, implementation, and subsequent monitoring. The countries were selected to reflect regional diversity and variation in both MOWIP timing and WPS-NAP cycles. And the countries comprise Ghana and Liberia, Canada and Uruguay, Jordan, Bangladesh, and Fiji. In respect to methodological limitations, well, firstly, the research is based on a relatively small number of interviews across the case countries. So 14 interviews with 23 stakeholders across 7 cases means that the findings are indicative rather than exhaustive. I think secondly, it's fair to say that engagement was more limited than we'd originally anticipated. And this most likely reflects time constraints and competing priorities among participants. However, it may also suggest varying degrees of institutional connectivity between MOWIP and WPS-NAP processes. And it might also point to broader trends, I think, in levels of engagement with the WPS agenda at this current time of global rollback on women's rights. So these limitations necessarily shape the scope of the analysis and the conclusions that can be drawn. Next slide, please. So on to key findings. So the research finds that MOWIP is widely valued as an analytical tool, but is still underutilised as a tool for strengthening WPS-NAP commitments relating to women's participation in security institutions and peacekeeping operations. Across the 7 cases, we identified, as Natalie referenced, 4 broad patterns of alignment between MOWIP processes and WPS-NAPs. So strong alignment, partial or indirect, prospective alignment, and minimal or disconnected. And Canada really stands out as the clearest example where MOWIP explicitly shapes WPS-NAP implementation and monitoring. So the Canadian Armed Forces MOWIP assessment is explicitly referenced in Canada's 3rd NAP. And rather than treating MOWIP as a standalone diagnostic, findings were very much integrated into implementation planning, into qualitative participation objectives, and the feminist monitoring approaches. So crucially, the assessment was used not only to improve peacekeeping deployment, but to address institutional culture and systemic issues affecting retention and leadership. And this illustrates MOWIP's real potential when alignment is intentional. So in Ghana, Uruguay, and Jordan, the connection was more indirect. And MOWIP findings certainly were used to inform gender policies and institutional reforms. They also were used to inform donor-funded initiatives that were very much aligned with WPS objectives, but they weren't systematically mapped into WPS-NAP texts. And there were timing mismatches between WPS-NAP and MOWIP cycles. Now in Fiji, the MOWIP is expected to inform a future WPS-NAP, but formal alignment is still pending while the MOWIP is being finalised. And in Liberia and Bangladesh, really, I think the processes were largely disconnected. So while MOWIP supported institutional gender discussions, the linkages between MOWIP governance appeared weaker. Okay, next slide, please. Three indicative enablers and constraints also emerged from the stakeholder interviews. Firstly, institutional ownership. So where MOWIP processes are well socialised within security sector institutions and championed by senior leadership, uptake and engagement with findings appears stronger. Secondly, WPS expertise is a critical enabler. And the extent to which MOWIP findings inform WPS-NAP development and implementation depends heavily on the WPS expertise of those receiving, translating, and applying the findings. And thirdly, unsurprisingly, financing remains a structural constraint. So both WPS-NAP implementation and MOWIP follow-up remain highly donor dependent. And I think while MOWIP may unlock donor resources, it does not in itself address underlying resourcing gaps. Next slide, please. So let me now unpack why MOWIP matters for strengthening WPS-NAPs using examples from the cases examined. So first, diagnosing institutional barriers. So in Canada, the Canadian Armed Forces MOWIP assessment really helped interrogate systematic challenges affecting women's retention, their leadership, and safety across the institution. And this reinforced the critical insight that meaningful participation conditions within the broader organisation. So similarly in Fiji, although the WPS-NAP is still forthcoming, stakeholders valued MOWIP precisely because it created a structured space to discuss institutional constraints affecting women across the discipline forces, well beyond deployment to peacekeeping operations. Second, moving beyond numbers. So many WPS-NAPs still focus, as I mentioned at the start, on numerical targets, so percentages recruited and deployed. MOWIP shifts this focus, so asking not just how many women are present, but are the conditions enabling them to stay, to advance and lead? And I think the Canadian case really illustrates how participation commitments can evolve from numerical deployment targets to qualitative institutional change objectives when MOWIP evidence is taken seriously. Third, providing baselines. So because MOWIP generates both qualitative and quantitative data, it offers credible baselines that can strengthen NAP monitoring frameworks. And in turn, this enables governments to set more realistic targets, to refine indicators, and to track progress beyond headcounts. And finally, to the last point for this slide, and that's supporting midterm course correction. And I think this is where the research shows significant untapped potential. So in Bangladesh, Jordan, and Liberia, MOWIP findings became available during the lifespan of existing WPS-NAPs. And in theory, this should have created an opportunity for mid-cycle adjustment. However, in practice, there were limited evidence that MOWIP findings were systematically integrated into NAP review processes. So in Bangladesh, for example, the extension of their NAP from 2022 to 2025 remained unchanged despite the availability of MOWIP findings. In Liberia, while the armed forces used MOWIP certainly to strengthen internal gender efforts, there was weak linkage to WPS-NAP monitoring or target adjustment. And in Jordan, MOWIP strengthened institutional engagement under the second NAP, but formal embedding into midterm monitoring frameworks appeared quite limited. So if positioned differently, particularly during midterm WPS-NAP reviews, MOWIP could help governments reassess stalled actions, refine indicators to capture maybe qualitative dimensions of participation, and really redirect resources towards reforms with the greatest institutional impact. Next slide, please. Okay, so in summary, when strategically aligned, MOWIP provides, I think, 6 distinct contributions. So ranging from baselines and diagnostics to advocacy leverage for mobilising political and financial support. And importantly, it also increases institutional buy-in because security institutions see their own data reflected. So if we accept that MOWIP has the strategic potential to strengthen WPS-NAP participation commitments, I think, the next step is really to consider how to enact that change in practice. And on to the next slide, please. So in the policy brief, I've made 8 recommendations, which here I've distilled into 4 key strategic shifts. So the first is align timing. And MOWIP assessments should not sit adjacent to WPS-NAP cycles. They should be deliberately aligned when drafting, refresh, or midterm review processes begin. Secondly, hardwire governance links. From the rapid review of the MOWIP assessments that have been published to date, a few really include detailed analysis of WPS-NAP commitments or make specific recommendations aligned to NAPs. And I think this is an opportunity lost. So going forward, it's really recommended to make those NAP linkages explicit in the MOWIP assessment process and to develop NAP-aligned recommendations. Third is the shift from numbers to conditions. So if WPS-NAPs continue to prioritise numerical deployment targets alone, they risk pretty shallow compliance. And MOWIP provides the analytical foundation to set qualitative targets related, to safety, to retention, leadership pathways, as we've discussed, the conditions that really make participation sustainable and influential. And then fourth, to strengthen ownership and resourcing. So MOWIP findings really need to be disseminated beyond gender units and visibly championed by senior leadership within security institutions. I think at the same time, use the credibility of MOWIP evidence-based data to leverage the domestic budgets and donor support aligned with WPS-NAP implementation. Translating these into practice obviously doesn't happen on its own. It depends on who acts, which brings me to my penultimate slide, what this means to different actors. So next slide, please. For security institutions undertaking MOWIP, timing is really important. So aligning assessments with NAP drafting or review cycles would help to ensure findings directly inform national commitments. I think institutions should use MOWIP data to set specific institution-owned participation targets under the WPS-NAPs, while translating recommendations into both quick wins and longer-term reforms. And importantly, findings should be disseminated widely across the institution, so not confined to the gender units. For ministries responsible for WPS-NAP implementation, coordination is key. Synchronising timelines, involving NAP coordination bodies in MOWIP interviews and validation workshops, and explicitly requesting analysis of existing NAP commitments within MOWIP assessments would really help strengthen the connections between NAP and MOWIP processes. And finally, for donors and partners, including the ELSI initiative, I think by incentivising alignment between MOWIP findings and NAP implementation plans, and by funding follow-on programming that operationalise MOWIP recommendations within WPS-NAP frameworks, MOWIP's longer-term impact will be strengthened. Next slide, please. So, to my final takeaway, look, where alignment with WPS-NAP is intentional, MOWIP can really sharpen participation commitments, improve accountability, and strengthen institutional ownership. And by doing so, I think we move one step closer to security institutions that reflect and benefit from the meaningful participation of women.